My project is on the misrepresentation of the LGBTQ community within the social world. My main question is, what are the different representations of the LGBTQ community seen through culture and how are they accepted? The different representations of the LGBTQ community are seen as cultures are expressed. However, there are different representations seen within the community itself. There are different ways it's seen within the developmental community, as well as the POC community, and other communities that have members of the LGBTQ. It is seen within these communities that these ideals are looked down upon in certain ways and non-justified/invalidated as time continues to move on in certain areas, such as the different ways that certain literature continues to prove heterosexual norms, such as certain same-sex couples seeming to have one gender to abide by, such as one seeming to abide by the male gender, one seeming to abide by the quote-unquote female gender. However, this community is definitely explored through generations to come and has different paths that it may cross. There seem to be guidelines within these communities, specifically within the different types of POC/religious communities. The government representatives and public officials emanating from Muslim majority and Islamic states openly refer to the Islamic religion as a justification for human rights abuses against queers, treating them publicly as inferior to human beings, or simply declaring that homosexuality is a sin worse than murder. Malaysia, LGBTQ individuals are treated as abnormal and subhuman. Raids are consistent, being abducted by police in any attempt for the media to advocate for LGBTQ rights. However, usually within these rights, it's usually censored, as well as the fact that these certain rights usually seem like it's going to have some sort of negative impact that's not going to be worth it. Furthermore, religious preachers who advocate the incompatibility between Islam and homosexuality and suggest that homosexuality is against nature are primarily responsible for the rise of hate speech, quote unquote, which is what they say, as along with the fact that it adds to Islamic extremism, particularly among youth. However, if they were to sit here genuinely and explain to youth in general, as well as the Muslim community as a whole, that the LGBTQ community is something that they definitely need to look into, as well as continue to accept and explore more in order for them to accept, they would sit here and they would genuinely understand how the incompatibility between Islam and homosexuality does not seem to be there. It's also shown that occasionally any of these states have amended criminal laws or discriminatory legislations, the psychological conviction of the unlawfulness and punishments. They usually have more of a exclusion and discrimination among LGBTQ persons of the society, along with the fact that culture and tradition and ultimately religious norms are used to sanctify brutal and the Muslim diaspora's unacceptably of homosexuality within Islam and Muslim societies, and it shows how it continues to persist. As a result, LGBT communities and individuals, Muslims seem to see how their world has their rights and how the rights seem to be massively abused. In certain cases, they can publicly acknowledge their sexualities. However, they end up marginalized, victims of parental or conjugal violence absorbed by the countries. It's seen that Islam attaches immense significance to traditional heterosexual marriage as well, only lawfully and religiously accepting vehicle for sexual contact amongst consenting heterosexual women and men, making it very difficult for the community to go on. It is also shown, however, that the Quran's positive view upon the celebration of sexual diversity does not get in the way of the legitimizing and regulation of heterosexual conduct through the institution of marriage, and the recognition of homosexuality and lesbianism as a legitimate practice for those who Allah Almighty has endowed with homosexual and lesbian tendencies. There's the understanding within the LGBTQ Sentinel where they continue to elaborate on their experiences by explaining how, when reflecting on their childhood, they spend countless hours questioning themselves for being different. They seem to have a very little distant memory of a comfort of their feelings or feeling like they can develop a sort of identity when they were storytelling or drawing or anything like that. It was more of an escape, and they continued to feel feelings of shame. However, they weren't provided with any of these answers that were consistently running through their mind with all these questions as to why they were the way they were or why they were acting the way they were. Going on today, they explained that there were really no books or resources available for questioning youth and no early introductions to the prospect of coming out. If there had been, they explained that they strongly believe that there would have been a better way to identify their feelings. But if they were to have been surrounded by a community, they would have felt way more invited to be able to come out with their feelings compared to later on in life. They continue explaining that most children don't know about LGBTQ plus communities until they meet a family member or a member of the community themselves, just in general. Therefore, explaining that introducing characters and stories with LGBTQ plus community storylines is a great way to introduce new norms to youth and encourage them to ask the right questions and understand themselves. It's also shown that bullies of the youth often act in response to not understanding their surroundings or being placed in certain situations where they don't really understand. So if they're placed in certain situations where they can't even understand themselves, they're going to continue to pick on others and continue to just feed into the issue because they're continuing to sit here and question themselves. They're going to continue to question everybody else. The introduction of a well-rounded series of characters and stories and things creates a richer mindset in the child's fantasy or in the literature in general. It allows children to see familiar family situations in their own stories, and it can comfort them greatly. Where they're often faced with heteronormative family situations in media and literature, where children of LGBTQ family communities can feel left out or ostracized in a certain way. Charles Cooley himself goes along and theorized that the individual concept of self is formed out of responses and reactions to what they observe and internalize from social surroundings, commonly known as the looking glass self. External sources may influence certain personalities because individuals reflect and internalize their environment. The different roles that characters play in children's literature serve as symbolic representations that provide sources of identification and inspire moral behavior. The text and images that appear in children's books reflect the conventional values of society because children show an early awareness of their sexual identity. It is important to definitely understand that there are different meanings and images that appear in children's books within homosexual or same-sex-oriented characters. It's definitely important to see that within these, it's definitely easier for an individual or more specifically a child to be able to be okay or know that there's comfort within finding themselves compared to feeling like they're forced to abide by a certain gender or abide by certain roles and things like that because they simply have an influence. They simply have something explained to them that it is okay, which is something that needs to be more present in literature. It is seen through these sources, as I've explained, that there's the ability for misrepresentation as time goes on. It's seen that there are still different heterosexual norms being applied and things, explaining that that's why these different couples need to be able to have literature that simply explains them for themselves, compared to a consistent comparison of a female partner and a male partner, compared to whichever partner being able to identify any characteristic, not particularly have any sort of